AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a series of recorded interviews with former senior U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I have a very interesting guest. His name is Ron Drabkin. He is the author of a brand new book called Beverly Hills Spy, and he has done peer review articles on Japanese espionage. He started this journey when he was a child in Los Angeles, when he discovered that his father worked for U.S. military counterintelligence. And then later he discovered that his grandfather was also in the business. And this led to him to a journey on 3 continents to discover previously classified information. Prior to writing, he was involved in several early startups in the U.S. He currently lives in Tokyo, where it is already tomorrow. And so we are doing our first AFIO Now interview across the international date line. Ron, welcome to AFIO.
Good morning, James.
Well, it's great to have you.
Yeah.
Please tell us a little bit about Frederick Rutland's early life and career.
Sure thing. Yeah, Frederick Rutland was very unusual for the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force in the early days, a low-born fellow. His father had been a day laborer, and he had joined the Royal Navy at age 14. He lied about his age. He was too young to enlist, and he had no education. And he worked his way up to be probably the most well-known and most accomplished Royal Naval aviator of World War I. In addition to some of his other feats, at the Battle of Jutland, he was the first person to do an aircraft carrier mission in a battle. So in 1916, the British fleet and the German fleet were about to fight, and they launched one plane, that was him, to go do the reconnaissance. And everyone could see where that was going. It ended up at Pearl Harbor and such like that, but airplanes were going to be the way of the future for the Navy, and he was the first one to accomplish this.
Despite his heroic accomplishments in numerous awards, why was the Royal Navy and then later the RAAF disinclined to promote his career?
You know, we can argue a lot of things, but he certainly, there was class issues. The Britain was at the time quite class focused, and the accounts from the day where, he was leading an aircraft carrier strike group, and his men were complaining that they didn't like taking orders from a lower class fellow. So that was certainly big. There was politics. He had a fairly flamboyant affair, which was really not done as a British officer. But yeah, he was not happy with the Royal Air Force, the post-World War I era.
Do you think this resulted in at least part of his motivation for cooperating with the Japanese later on?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And one day it's in the records where one day the Japanese Imperial Navy had an office in Westminster in London, and their goal was to obtain new technology, and they wanted new aircraft technology. And this fellow walked in. He said, "My name is Rutland. I'd like to talk to you." And they said, "We know exactly who you are, and we'd love to talk to you." Yeah.
What led to Rutland going to Japan and cooperating with the Japanese? Was he the only Brit to do this, or was there an actual sanctioned program?
There was both. There was an official Royal British sanctioned program under a Scottish nobleman named Lord Semple. This was primarily driven by the British aircraft industry really losing a lot of money after World War I, and they wanted to make some sales. And one of the lead designers of the aircraft carrier Sopwith that made the Camel, he was actually working for Mitsubishi as well at that time.
How much did Rutland contribute to Japanese aircraft and aircraft carrier design?
It was very significant, according to some of the files that we discovered. The early aircraft, they were a very, not only poor functionality, but they were sort of made out of string and canvas and balsa wood. They were very dangerous, and they really didn't work all that well. They had a very bad tendency for landing on the aircraft carrier, bouncing, hitting a gust of wind and flying overboard, and then the pilot's killed. And he was able to fix all that and help with the redesign of the carriers themselves.
And so, jumping ahead just a little bit, the aircraft that he helped to design and the carriers that he helped to design, are those the ones that actually attacked Pearl Harbor?
Yes, absolutely. So he helped redesign the Akagi and the Kaga, which were the 2 lead carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. He was there. He had told the British that he was working for Mitsubishi. That was not true. He was actually working directly for the Imperial Japanese Navy. And they actually put him up in a very crazy place. They put him up on the beach, very close to the main Japanese naval base in Yokosuka. He wasn't living with the other foreigners, which was really unusual at the time. But that meant the Japanese Navy admirals who lived nearby could just stop by his house.
What led to Rutland moving to Hollywood? And what kind of activities did he undertake on behalf of the Japanese?
Yeah, that's a crazy story. After he helped design the carriers, he went back to England and he was working for his rich brother-in-law's company, a company called Scamell. For those of you with children or grandchildren, you may be familiar with Thomas the Tank Engine, those the evil trucks that fight with the trains. The evil trucks were modeled on his brother-in-law's company's trucks. They were fighting against trains to take stuff to the port. Anyway, he was bored to tears. He'd been an international agent. He'd flown a 80 horsepower plane off of a ship. And here he was, a sales guy for trucks, right? And one day, the Japanese were, the writing was kind of on the wall, even 10 years before Pearl Harbor, that there would be a clash between the U.S. and Japan. And the Japanese really needed to get more information from the U.S. And it was cultural, it was linguistic. They really had problems doing so. And so one day he was approached again by some of the same Japanese officers that he knew very well. And they said, we'd like you to go to the U.S. And they basically asked him to be a sleeper. So he'd go to Hollywood, have a nice glamorous lifestyle. And if a war was to erupt, he could give them lots of information. And and he thought that was a great idea.
Why was the U.S. West Coast so significant in terms of U.S. aviation?
About 70% of all the aircraft manufactured were in the Los Angeles area and San Diego. And then the rest were at Boeing. So as you know, a lot of the early aircraft design had been on the East Coast, like in Rochester. And the weather is just so bad there that they all moved to California. And Lockheed and Douglas and all the Consolidated were all in the LA area.
So he was in the right place.
Yes. Oh, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet was there as well. So the U.S. Pacific Fleet later went to Pearl Harbor, but at this time it was in Los Angeles.
Who were some of the Hollywood luminaries that Rutland met? And what was their role in all of this?
Yeah, it's one of the craziest things of all that a couple of the fairly well-known Hollywood stars were actually FBI assets and had helped the FBI arrest some of these folks and kept it a secret their whole lives. It's great. Probably the most well-known one that shows up most in the FBI documents is Boris Karloff. It was funny. He was given the FBI information at the same time he was filming a film that was called British Intelligence. And in British Intelligence, Karloff plays a German spy, believe it or not. But at the same time, he was helping U.S. intelligence. There's another fellow named Alan Mowbray, who was the founder of the Screen Actors Guild. And he was the prototypical butler in all the early Hollywood films. Yeah, and he was helping the FBI quite a bit. Charlie Chaplin wasn't, as far as I know, that could be in the documents. Chaplin doesn't appear to have been helping the FBI, but who knows, maybe he was. He was certainly at all the same parties.
What about Charlie Chaplin's kind of butler, Kono?
Yeah, it's that's again, when I was getting all these declassified documents and just reading up, it's some of the it's just really surprising and shocking. So it wasn't unusual for Hollywood stars at the time to have a Japanese assistants. And Chaplin went for an all-Japanese crew. His butler, his maids, manservants, chefs, the whole works. And, the reason he did this, he said, was that they were very good at cleaning. They're much better than Americans, and the quote was, you give a Japanese cleaning guy a broom and he goes into the corners and gets every bit. And the Americans, they just kind of smash the dirt around the middle of the room. Okay. So that was what he told people. That was not true, right? That was not true. He had a lot of affairs with younger women or girls, I guess, illegal affairs. And it was really to his advantage to have housekeeping staff who couldn't speak English. The paparazzi would go up and try to interview them and they wouldn't, speak to them. So that was great. And his lead butler was a fellow named Kono, who worked for him for about 20 years. Glamorous guy, unlike the other Japanese, great English speaker, beautiful double-breasted suits, very smooth character. And Kono took Chaplin around the world and eventually had quite the bad falling out with Chaplin's third wife, Paulette Goddard. And she had him fired. Yeah.
What were the priorities of the FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the State Department vis-a-vis Japan in 1940 and 41?
It was really divergent, and you can see in some of the declassified documents it started to get a little bit nasty, right? So if you look at the three of them, the ONI, their charter was to protect the U.S. fleet, right? And the number one threat to the U.S. fleet was obviously Japan. It was the only country that could actually get into a real naval war with the U.S. And so they were, they saw the current threat, right? And they would do whatever they could to address it, right? The State Department on the other side was trying to keep all the tensions low. Keep this out of the news. Don't, there's these Japanese spies running around. Don't say anything. For God's sake, don't get it in the newspaper, right? And so they were like keeping it down. The FBI at the first, it seemed like they really couldn't be bothered. They were the U.S. sort of a little East Coast based. Their Nazism had arrived. It seemed like Japan was a little far away, and the FBI just really wasn't paying much attention, at least in the beginning.
How did the rivalry between the FBI and ONI impact the situation? And how did the FBI react to ONI's more aggressive stance?
Yeah, the FBI appeared to be a little bit to be tied at some of the stuff ONI was doing. ONI was definitely, due to the imminent threat, they were not really following rules or laws or anything. They were just kind of going nuts. One of the breaking and entering. There was a Japanese Navy guy who was driving down to deliver some documents down to Tijuana to get to Japan, and he was driving through Bakersfield, California, down in the middle of California, and he was stopped for speeding by the local police. And that particular police force happened to have their captain just recently retired from ONI, and all of a sudden he was risking arrest, and they had to beat the living daylights out of him. Right? Okay, so the FBI was fit to be tied about this kind of thing. The last thing they want is State Department coming down on them, impact international relations. The quote was, there may be a war between the U.S. and Japan, but it won't be caused by us. And just you see the professionalism of Hoover's FBI, right? You can just see all the, there's no opinions in the files. It's like we're following the rules. So you can see why it would be a fairly big clash.
What led Rutland to have to leave the U.S. and return to the U.K.?
Yeah, well, this was, the cover-up was on all sides. This was the last thing that people wanted in the newspapers. The State Department did not want this in the newspapers because they were trying to, do this peace talks with Japan. Right. The FBI, well, this didn't look good. One of the most famous British war heroes have been running around Hollywood with Charlie Chaplin for the last 8 years. That wouldn't look good. And the British at the time, they were trying to influence the U.S. to come into the war against Hitler. And they had a very large influence operation to get the U.S. public on board with, joining the war. And so this would have looked absolutely horrible if Rutland, his story had gotten into the newspapers. And it almost did. The other Japanese spies were arrested. It was in the papers. It was a big problem with the peace talks. So long story short, the arrangement was made with the British as they promised him quite a bit of attractive stuff. And they said, when do you come back to Britain? And we'll find like a good job for you. And he said, that sounds great. He says, are you sure, maybe, what you really want me to do is you really want me to help you try to anticipate this coming Japanese attack. And he was lobbying to go be sent to Mexico City where the Japanese intelligence operation was. And he was basically saying, look, I know the Japanese Navy better than any foreigner. I've been working with these guys for 20 years. Yamamoto, all these admirals, these are my buddies. If I go hang out with them, I won't know the exact particulars of the coming attack, but I'll know when it is. I'll know, I'll give all sorts of clues. I can help you quite a bit. And they said, well, anyway, why don't you go back to England and we can talk about that. And so he said, I'm trying to make sure the Japanese think that you think I'm the best asset around. And so interestingly, he didn't take a ship back to Britain. Back then, the ships were being sunk by the German U-boats, and you couldn't buy a flight across the Atlantic, of course. But they arranged to have him, a bomber basically was flying over to Britain. They gave him a special ride back, and he landed in Britain, and he did not get the reception he was thinking he was going to get.
So what kind of treatment did Rutland receive from the British particularly after the Japanese attacks on both Pearl Harbor and Singapore.
Yeah, you can only imagine what the guy was thinking, by the way. He had been famous in World War I. One of his big naval feats was he flew planes off of the battlecruiser Repulse, which the Japanese had just sunk. They had sunk his old ship, basically. So, he was fit to be tied in that respect. And the British intelligence services were almost exactly like the American ones. British naval intelligence, so Godfrey, Ian Fleming, and MI5 were on totally different pages. The Navy was thinking this guy he's our hero. And yeah, he's probably done a couple crazy stuff, but we got to take care of him. But MI5's like, look, we've got a large file on this guy. He's been dirty for 20 years. And soon after Pearl Harbor, he got a knock on the door. 2 constables said, sir, you're coming with us. And he was thrown into Brixton Prison without trial. And
was that the end of the story, or is there more to his incarceration and final release?
There is more to the story. The story is quite, so many celebrities involved. The Navy was, some of the admirals, the fellow who started the British Commandos, was writing to Churchill to get him out of prison. MI5 was not budging, and he caused them quite a bit of trouble. He found out the home addresses of the MI5 agents. He was posting them letters. He sent letters to every member of the House of Commons, quoting the naval admirals, saying that he was clean. And they said, just talk to the FBI, talk to the U.S. Naval Intelligence, and they'll tell you I was actually on the right side.
And that brings us to perhaps some of the most interesting information that you discovered from recently declassified files, and that's the FBI cover-up. How did that play out?
Yeah, so the FBI was So the cover-up around Pearl Harbor is a bigger story. And I think what I've found is some new and interesting conversation that adds to this larger story. So, a few days after Pearl Harbor, Hoover wrote a note to Roosevelt saying, look, those guys in Hawaii, the admiral and the general, they need to be, taken out. It's all their fault, right? And the cover-up was pretty extreme. I've never worked in intelligence myself, but I certainly have a lot of friends and, family members who did. And, clearly in counterintelligence, you get a lot of signals. A lot of people will tell you that there's a spy somewhere, and you have to filter it. And so the question is exactly how compelling were these stories to the FBI? And I think the answer is they were pretty compelling. Rutland was out there saying, look, I am the number one asset for the Japanese Navy. I've been working with them for 20 years. They will be attacking, right? And there's numerous other clues. There was a Serbian double agent for the Nazis who were giving them the same clues. There was quite a bit. And in the files that have been declassified, it's quite clear. There's the letters from Hoover to the LA office, send his file back. We want to edit it and send it back. There's one of the FBI agents had talked about Rutland working with the U.S. Naval Intelligence Group, and there's a memo from Hoover saying, okay, yes, this what Rutland was saying about him and I is absolutely true. It was a quote, and for God's sake, he doesn't say for God's sake, do not talk about this with anyone outside the bureau. It'll embarrass the bureau. Ixnay. So the cover-up's quite clear in the documents.
Well, the name of the book is The Beverly Hills Spy. It's a fascinating read. I thoroughly enjoyed it and recommend it to our audience. And I would like to thank Ron Drabkin for a very interesting story.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.